All right. Events leading to the Civil War. We're good? We left off with the Free State, Slave State debate. This is continued division between North and South over the Free State, Slave State balance. Remember, from the beginning of the early new nation, the original 13, technically, we'll say Vermont, which comes in as number 14. From there on out, we have this balance that continues, like a free and a slave state kind of come in every year to 2 years together, sometimes in the same year, all right? But as we start to move into the era of manifest destiny, the free state, slave state balance is going to be a little more complicated with the Louisiana Purchase, with the admission of Texas, especially with the Mexican War. Some key examples: Missouri, Maine, Texas, Oregon, California, Kansas, Nebraska. These are all issues we're going to discuss today. As more and more people move west, the big question mark is, will that new territory be free or will it be slave? All right? We are on a collision course to war. Numerous compromises are struck to keep the free state, slave state balance. I think the person that is a part of that is Henry Clay, the great compromiser that we're going to talk about here momentarily. This all starts at the Constitutional Convention with the Three-Fifths Compromise, and it's expanded with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793. So what America is trying to do is stay out of civil war, but the truth of the matter is, whether people want to admit it or not, or want to own it, the issue of slavery are the seeds or roots of the start of the American Civil War. And that'll all come together as we move forward today. So, free states in the north, slave states in the south. You keep in mind, not all of those slave states will join the Confederacy. Some of those border slave states will stay in the Union, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the Civil War, or at least the pre-Civil War era. The start of Lesson 10. All right, so the Missouri Compromise is passed in 1820 by Congress, and by President James Monroe. This is during his time in office. Henry Clay, seen here, the great compromiser, born in Virginia by way of Kentucky, is the guy that is going to broker this deal. People, after the Louisiana Purchase was made, start to flood out into the territory. The first state that enters from the territory is very easy to remember. It's what state? What's the first state in the Louisiana Territory to enter as an official state? Louisiana, thank you. It enters as a slave state. Now we're looking at Missouri. Not everybody in the Missouri Territory wanted slavery, but overwhelmingly, most people did. If you brought Missouri in, how would you keep the balance? Well, what do we remember about Maine from the colonial period and the early new nation? What previous colony, now state, was Maine part of? I hear you guys mumbling it. Somebody mumble Massachusetts? That is it. Okay? Maine was part of Massachusetts. All right? Remember, long ago, Maine attempted to become a colony, but it just didn't work out. They didn't have the population for it. Also, Massachusetts didn't want to lose it because Maine is rich in resources. For example, what kind of resources? Maine. Anybody been to Maine? Maine? Well, a lot of rum production. There's also a lot of timber, lobster, fish, furs, whales. Sure, a little bit. Not in parts of Appalachia up there had it, but not on the large scale farther in southern Appalachia. So, Maine will enter as a free state. Keep in mind that this is not the only part of the compromise. I want everybody to pay attention to this map. An imaginary line is drawn along the 3630 parallel latitude line here, declaring that everything in the Louisiana Purchase that was north of that line, with the exception of Missouri, would be free. And everything to the south would be slave, which really is just allowing for the admission of one more slave state from the Louisiana Territory, and that slave state is going to be Arkansas. We're just kicking the can down the road, all right? The Civil War is just 41 years away from this compromise. There's also what is called the Talmadge Amendment that's proposed in connection to the Missouri Compromise. James Talmadge Jr. of New York proposes, a member of Congress, he proposes an amendment that says after a certain amount of time, once slaves in Missouri reach a certain age, they will become emancipated and free, and their children will become free. And over time, what this will do is emancipate all slaves in Missouri. And maybe we think about doing this for other states to move away from the institution. Well, this made it through the House, but it got blocked by the Senate, because what crop is thriving in the South that has this high demand on slave labor? Cotton. Very good. All right. Anybody have any questions about the Missouri Compromise? Missouri becomes a slave state, Maine becomes a free state, and all the remainder of that Louisiana Territory above the 36°30, with the exception of Missouri, will be free, and below will be slave. Now, between the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, Henry Clay had negotiated another compromise, and that was the Nullification Crisis, which lowered the tariff to prevent what state from seceding? No, southern state. What southern state threatened to secede during the Nullification Crisis, or the high tariff? You're close. South Carolina. Very good. So Clay had prevented the country from breaking apart in the Missouri Compromise, had prevented it from breaking apart through the Nullification Crisis. Now, this is Clay's final hurrah. This is his last compromise. He will work with John C. Calhoun of South Carolina and Daniel Webster of New Hampshire. They were known as the Great American Triumvirate because they had negotiated a lot of these deals together. There's also a young senator on the scene now from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas. They called him the Little Johnny. What they're going to do in this plan is try to put together a negotiation to keep the country out of the Civil War 11 years before the war unfolds. It is all revolving around California. You have the right shirt on for today. California does not practice slavery, but I do want you all to realize California is not like an abolitionist stronghold. They're just, remember, they were their own country for like 2 years. They're willing to come in as a free state as long as a transcontinental rail line is built to connect them to the east. All right? So there's some strings attached. I want everybody to look at the map. The Utah Territory consists of Nevada, Utah, and part of Colorado. The New Mexico Territory consists of New Mexico, part of Texas, and all of Arizona. Here's the proposal. In this compromise, there's going to be 5 parts to it. California enters as a free state. The Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory will determine whether they become a slave or a free state based off of popular sovereignty. This is a really good vocab term for the day. This means people have the right to vote whether they want the territory to be slave or free. Now, remember, what religious groups are already out in Utah? The Mormons, right? But the government's like, sorry, Mormons, not yet. Because the Mormons are actually interested in statehood, but they want to be a free state. And at this point in time, New Mexico and Arizona are just not that largely populated. There are some Americans out there. There's also Mexicans who are now going to ultimately move into the process of being naturalized American citizens, and we have Native Americans out in this territory. So we're still a ways away. None of this right here, guys, none of that statehood out there is going to happen with the exception of California and Oregon. That's not going to happen until after the Civil War ends, all right? The next part of the compromise, the slave trade, but not the institution of slavery, would be outlawed in Washington, D.C. The fourth part, if you're ever wondering why we have this severe right angle that separates Texas and New Mexico, it's because of the Compromise of 1850. It formalized the border between Texas and New Mexico. And then the last thing is tremendously controversial. It is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. What makes this Fugitive Slave Act controversial is not only are slave holders in the South able to hire bounty hunters to go hunt down runaway slaves, they are also allowed to take anyone hiding or harboring a runaway slave to court. And those people could potentially, not only be fined, but serve jail time. So the new Fugitive Slave Act is really, it's outrageous to the North. This is kind of crazy that it's happening. The South, those who support the slave system, absolutely love it. Also, to make it even more absurd, judges made more money by releasing slaves back to the South than by freeing. With all that being said, it takes quite a while to get this whole compromise bundled up. And once they do, the president of the United States at the time, Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, vetoes it. And the Whig party's like, are you kidding me? We have another Whig not following through with the political agenda. Now, not too long after Taylor vetoes the Compromise of 1850, he will contract cholera and die in office. And then his vice president, 13th U.S. President, Millard Fillmore, comes into office and rubber stamps it and signs it into law. Within a year of this compromise, all the people involved, like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, the 3 of them are dead. And now the new compromiser on the scene is the young senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. So that's a little bit about the Compromise of 1850. So here we have Henry Clay on the Senate floor proposing the compromise. California becomes a free state. The Utah and New Mexico territory will be determined through popular sovereignty. Slavery, the slave trade, but not slavery, is outlawed in D.C. The border between Texas and New Mexico is drawn, but it also leads to this horrible Fugitive Slave Act that's passed in 1850. That was a big inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe finishing Uncle Tom's Cabin when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. She ends up helping a slave to freedom as a result of this act. All right. Am I moving too fast? Is everybody good? Does this make sense? All right. Here's where the compromises go wrong. And that's going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is Stephen Douglas's time to shine. All the members of the triumvirate are dead. He's the new guy on the scene. He's got like national recognition at this rate. He's also a bit greedy because remember, there are strings attached to California. What do they want built? What do they want? Transcontinental Railroad. Very good, guys. They want a transcontinental railroad. What city does Stephen Douglas want to make sure that rail line goes through if he's from Illinois? Chicago. Very good. So a huge part of this compromise has to do with the Transcontinental Railroad, which, believe it or not, this compromise ends up stalling the construction of the railroad because the Transcontinental Railroad won't be completed until after the Civil War. And eventually it'll reach Chicago, but his plans are all fall apart because what he pushes for is the popular sovereignty thing. The funny thing about popular sovereignty, any historian or student that knows history, when the term popular sovereignty is mentioned, he is the first guy that pops into your brain. He's not even the guy that coined the term. The guy that coined the term was a guy from Michigan by the name of Lewis Cass. But he runs with the rhetoric. So his goal is to undo the Missouri Compromise and to allow for popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territory. The president at the time is a Democrat by the name of Franklin Pierce. Pierce is a bit of a puppet for the Democratic Party, and Stephen Douglas is very much pulling the strings here. So he signs this into law. It is going to be a total disaster because what will happen are forces from the north who want freedom in Kansas and pro-slavery supporters from the south who want slavery in Kansas pour into the Kansas territory, and they ultimately establish two different governments. One government is pro-slavery, and the other government is anti-slavery, and it's going to lead to a 2-year border war that actually lasts in total it leads to about 10 years of violence. These events are known as Bleeding Kansas. The other thing that happens as a result of this compromise is the birth of the Republican Party. The reason I've told you multiple times that we want to look at the Republican Party as an umbrella is because all these different party groups that were splintered start to huddle under the Republican umbrella. Like the Whig Party split into two. There were what were called conscious Whigs, who were anti-slavery, and cotton Whigs, who were pro-slavery. The conscious Whigs went to the Republican Party. The old members of the Liberty Party went to the Republican Party. The old members of the Free Soil Party went to the Republican Party. So now the Republican Party, as we know it today, different platform, different goals, is formed in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about Bleeding Kansas. Those who fought against slavery in Bleeding Kansas are known as Jayhawkers. Those who fought to support slavery, mainly coming over from Missouri, were called Border Ruffians. And most of the fighting occurred on the border of Missouri and Kansas. Questions up to this point? Is everybody good? All right. So Bleeding Kansas, northern pro-slavery forces, northern anti-slavery forces, and southern pro-slavery forces are going to do battle. It is estimated somewhere between 200 and 300 people died in the events of Bleeding Kansas. Number of those that were killed in the events were actually civilians. This was a period of time of mob violence. Some people from Kansas and Missouri believe that the Civil War actually started on their border, not at Fort Sumter. I don't know if I'll go that far, but this event will be one of the dominoes that will get knocked down to take us to the Civil War. During these elections for popular sovereignty, people are legit showing up to the ballot box armed, knives, swords, pistols, muskets, ready to do battle at the ballot box. This is also going to lead to most of the violence occurring in and around Lawrence. That's where the most deadly violence of the events happen. Another very infamous event of Bleeding Kansas is devout abolitionist, Congregationalist Christian John Brown. Remember, I introduced you to him at the start of this lesson in the painting at the beginning. He and his sons, with broadswords, are going to bash in the heads of 5 pro-slavery ruffians along Potawatomi Creek in Franklin, Kansas. They will ultimately lead a larger plot at Harper's Ferry, which we'll talk about momentarily. Violence even spread to the floor of the U.S. Senate. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, former member of the Free Soil Party and one of the founding members of the Republican Party, is going to give a speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas." In this speech, he will call out publicly Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Andrew Butler, senator from South Carolina, was not there, but his cousin Preston Brooks was. He marches down to the Senate floor and nearly beats Charles Sumner to death with a cane. After this event, everybody starts going into the House and Senate chambers armed. Swords, knives, pistols, muskets, ready to do battle in Congress. All right? The South will actually send Preston Brooks celebratory canes for the beating that he gave Sumner. Sumner's gonna survive the beating, and we're gonna talk more about him when we get into the Civil War. The election of 1856 is going to lead to sort of this do-nothing period to prevent, nothing is really done to prevent the Civil War from happening. The guy that wins the election is Pennsylvania Democrat James Buchanan, who's often considered one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. He defeats the first Republican candidate for president, John C. Fremont, the guy who had blazed the Oregon Trail. Fremont was an anti-slavery guy, not an abolitionist, but he didn't want to see slavery spread in the West. He was easily defeated by James Buchanan, but Buchanan is going to be more consumed with the Mormons in Utah than keeping the country out of civil war. So this is the event in which Preston Brooks will beat Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate in D.C. Questions up to this point? Is everybody good? All right. Has anyone ever heard of this guy before? Dred Scott? Anybody? Yeah? Like a couple people? Good. This court case is one of the most important and one of the worst decisions in American history. Arguably the worst decision. The only other decision that we would put up against this one that was worse would be Plessy v. Ferguson, that upheld Jim Crow laws. Dred Scott was born a slave in Southampton County, Virginia. He was sold to a slave owner in Alabama. From Alabama, he was sold to a doctor in Missouri. that doctor was tied to the U.S. Army. So Dred Scott ends up traveling into Illinois and then later the Wisconsin Territory. What are those territories? They're free. Very good. This is where he meets his wife. They have a couple of children. His owner dies. And now he's actually not really, he's technically suing his owner's wife and their children for his freedom. And he's not only suing for his own freedom, he's also suing for the freedom of his wife and technically for their children. This thing goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And it is one of the worst decisions in American history because technically, by law, his status was free. Because once you're in free territory, you found a pretty substantial loophole in the law here. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court, now under Roger B. Taney of Maryland, who was a former slaveholder, no longer John Marshall, he's passed away, the fifth Chief Justice will rule against Scott, declaring Dred Scott was not a U.S. citizen, therefore he couldn't sue. Residence in free territory didn't make him free. Congress didn't have the authority to ban slavery in any territory, and it officially outlawed the Missouri Compromise. The North outraged, the South elated, because they're like, oh, cool, there's no free or slave territory. Slavery can spread everywhere now. So now we're one step closer to the Civil War as a result of the Dred Scott decision. Also, I find this pretty interesting. Notice, you will likely see this Dred Scott case written Scott v. Sandford, and you will also see it Scott v. Sanford. A clerk made a spelling error, and it just stuck. And there it is. Scott v. Sanford. But it should have been Sandford. We'll talk about another clerical error that's kind of interesting when we get to the Civil War. All right, you guys good? Okay, so the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In 1858, Stephen Douglas is up for re-election in the Senate. He is a national prominent candidate. Even though he's not popular with everybody, he has been a part of the Compromise of 1850, and he brokered the disastrous Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln is absolutely unknown. He's just kind of coming out of nowhere, born in Kentucky, self-taught law, had a law practice in Illinois and Springfield, had a little bit of military service in the Black Hawk War, gets, the nickname Honest Abe, and they go on this campaign tour throughout Illinois in the Senate race, and they're running on the whole basis of popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas is like, yes, popular sovereignty. People should vote whether they want to be free or slave. Whereas Lincoln, remember, do y'all remember what party he had been part of where he opposed the Mexican War? Whigs. Very good. He was a Whig. He's what we would consider a conscious Whig. He's now joined the Republican Party. He's basically saying, hey, the country cannot remain half slave, half free. I want all of you to understand crystal clear, Abraham Lincoln, before the Civil War and even at the start of it, he is not an abolitionist. Okay? He's not. By the end of the war and before his assassination, he will become an abolitionist. But at the beginning, he's not. He's just saying a house divided cannot stand, country can't remain half slave, half free. But in the minds of the South, he's the devil, right? And what this Senate race does, it gets him recognized and exposed. He's now got a little bit more of a national recognition. And he is the South's worst nightmare. He loses this election. Stephen Douglas wins it. But some interesting things occur. For example, Lincoln becomes famous and then ultimately goes on to win the election of 1860. However, Douglas and this whole popular sovereignty business, this all ends up dividing and splintering the Democratic Party. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about John Brown's reign. How am I doing over here?
5 minutes.
Sweet. John Brown, devout abolitionist, believed kind of like Nat Turner that he was put on earth by God to destroy slavery by force. He and 21 followers are going to launch a surprise attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, now in West Virginia, formerly in Virginia. Y'all know where Harper's Ferry is? It's kind of like on the border of like Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. It's all like right there. What is an arsenal? It's a place where you store weapons. He and his followers want to pull together weapons, arm slaves, and do battle. But they attacked on October 16, 1859, and when they attack on the early hours of the Sunday morning, what they're not expecting to come across is a passenger train. They come across the passenger train, they halt it. The first person they kill is a free African American. They let the train go, they raid the arsenal. Word gets back to D.C. that there's a raid on the arsenal. Townspeople and local militia arm themselves and surround the fort or the arsenal. This gives the U.S. government time to station or move 200 Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee and Major Jeb Stuart by rail from D.C. to Harper's Ferry. Bless you. Within 36 hours, he will be completely surrounded. Those of his group that are not killed, including him, will be arrested, tried, and executed. His execution is very interesting because the people that are brought there to guard him are the cadets from VMI, and the person that is leading them is their professor, Thomas J. Jackson, who will later remember as Stonewall. One of the other guard details that is a little hodgepodge militia force that is known as the Richmond Grays, and in that group is a part-time militiaman, full-time actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth. So quite a odd situation here. John Brown will become the leading martyr of the abolitionist cause heading into the Civil War. Herman Melville will call him the meteor of the war. And we're on the path here toward Civil War. So we have John Brown here on the left, pictured before the raid, and then this is a painting of John Brown approaching the gallows. The four presidents, from Polk to Lincoln, these two guys served one term together. Pierce was a one-termer. Buchanan was a one-termer. What we refer to these guys as are the lame ducks. Like Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready, war hero of the Mexican War. The only thing he did in office was veto the Compromise of 1850, and then he died of cholera. His vice president, 13th President Millard Fillmore, Whig from New York, signed the compromise into law, and then the Whig Party doesn't renominate him. 14th President Franklin Pierce, he does get one thing accomplished, but we do need to remember, give Franklin Pierce a little bit of historical recognition here. As he was entering office, his kid died and he fell into a really deep depression in the presidency. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act into law, total disaster. He did make the Gadsden Purchase, which was that tract of land from Texas to California, southern Arizona, New Mexico, for a rail line to connect California and Texas. But the Austin Manifesto was a controversial attempt of the South to try to overthrow Cuba from Spain. Why would the South wanted to overthrow Cuba in a military coup d'etat? Anyone? Good. Specifically, what they grow a lot of, or what did they grow a lot of, and Cuba still do? Sugar. And what labor system was in Cuba? Anyone? Slavery. The South was trying to lead a military coup d'etat to turn Cuba into a slave state. It all fell apart. But it almost started a war with Spain. All right. Sorry, I'm going over a little bit. This is where I pump the brakes today. The presidential election of 1860. Because of the whole popular sovereignty business, the Democratic Party splintered in two. The Northern Democrats chose Stephen Douglas as their candidate. The Southern Democrats chose Vice President John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky, who had served as Vice President under James Buchanan. Republicans chose Lincoln, and they did a really brilliant political move. They held their nominating convention in Chicago, and they sold all of these, this crazy number of counterfeit tickets. So all these people get tickets, and they can't get everybody into the facility. No one can sit down. It just seems like it's like the craziest thing. And then they nominate Lincoln, and there's just this massive party about it. So they're just trying to get more support for Lincoln because he's not known everywhere, but he's becoming more of a national figure. Does that make sense? And then the Constitutional Union Party, which were made up of cotton Whigs, they ran John Bell from Tennessee. Lincoln ends up winning the election off the Electoral College because he's not even on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. And the South, the deep South, is if this guy becomes president, we're seceding because they see him as an abolitionist. Well, early December, it's official. He's declared the 16th president. December 20th, South Carolina secedes from the Union. From January to March, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, they're all going to join the Confederacy. And I'm going to teach you more about the first shots of the war at Fort Sumter next class when we start lesson 10. But after Fort Sumter, that's when Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas joined the Confederacy. There's still a big question mark about the border states. They're not going to join the Confederacy. They'll stay in the Union. So there we have the election of 1860. Lincoln winning the political race against Stephen Douglas, Breckinridge, and John Bell. That's what Lincoln looks like when he was elected. This is also where they start giving the nickname the rail splitter. And then over here, the Charleston Mercury, the Union is dissolved. And then finally, first shots of the Civil War, Fort Sumter. This is a sketch from Fort Moultrie. How many people have gone down to Charleston before? Has anybody ever been to Sullivan's Island? If you've ever been to Sullivan's Island, the very end of Sullivan's Island, that's where Fort Moultrie was. We'll talk more about this when we start lesson 10. Any questions at all? Everybody good? Cool.